Okay, we're here today to talk about what happens when images seems perfectly exposed and what problems we run into and how we deal with it. Now, take a look at this image. How do we know it's perfectly exposed? Well, if you look at the histogram, it falls within the dynamic range of the camera. Nothing is overblown or underexposed, and everything on at first glance looks like it's supposed to be if you just look at the histogram. However, if you examine the image further, you'll notice that the contrast in the mountain is a little bit low, and the sky lacks color that was present. Now, the water on the beach seems kind of well exposed, but that's because I made the adjustments in raw converter so that the foreground actually looks as good as I can possibly make it in raw converter without going overboard. Now, why does this happen? Why is it that even though the image histogram looks like all the information is there, however, the image or parts of the image seems a little bit overexposed and other parts seem lot like they lack contrast. Now, this happens because there's a difference between the dynamic range processing of the camera sensor and the dynamic range processing of the human brain. The human brain, as the contrast gets low, will get more sensitive to the contrast. So even though you're standing out there in the field, you will see the scene as if it is brilliantly exposed. For example, there was light falling on the mountains and it was glowing, and the sky was slightly more blue. In fact, if you guys want to see what the sky looked like, the sky had colors which sort of resembled this. And there was more contrast in the sky. The clouds were actually a little bit whiter than they appear over here. Now, what happens is that the human dynamic range adjusts to change to match the conditions that it encounters. Um, the extreme case of this is when the dynamic range adjusts for night vision. If you suddenly place in a very dark area, at first you'll see no contrast, and then slowly your eyes will adjust, and the sensitivity and contrast ratios of the eyes will adjust so that you'll actually start making out shapes and details in the dark areas. Um, so the same thing happens when the contrast of the scene compresses. You will stand there and you'll remember that, hey, there's this glowing rock face, the cliff face, and the sky was absolutely blue and the water was white. However, when you capture it on the film, it doesn't quite look as good as what you remember. So the question is, how do you deal with this? Well, the way to deal with this is to go into Photoshop and make targeted adjustments. Now, let me show you what happens and how to make targeted adjustments. So at this point in time, I'm going to open this image in Photoshop. And I've already opened it up, and so I will just say done and go into Photoshop. And here's the image that you are looking at. Now, what happens in this image is we will stop and analyze what's going on in the sky, in the mountains, on the beach, and in the water. So I'll turn on the layer of text. And after analyzing, this is what I came up with. The sky looks a bit overexposed. It lacks color, and it has low contrast. Now, just by blending a darker image, the color in the skies are restored, but then you have to do something to restore the contrast. The mountains that is here can also use a bit more contrast. Now, the beach appears properly exposed, but can use some cloning. And the water seems slightly underexposed. Now, why do I say that? So let's analyze all different areas and see what happens. So to find out whether the water is properly exposed or not, I'm going to actually just draw a selection around the water. Now once I draw a selection around the water, you'll notice that my histogram, the brightest part of my histogram, doesn't really go too much to the right. It means that the white water that I remember now appears a little bit gray. So the first thing I'm going to do is go ahead and restore the luminosity of the water. So there you go. So I created a layer and made adjustments so that the white areas of the water appear more whiter. I didn't want to push it all the way, but I wanted it to be bright enough where you can see the details in the water, and it appears like the water is white, like the foam that you remember while you were shooting on the beach. Then the second thing I did was I actually made cloning adjustments. Now the cloning adjustments were made out of base layer using a clone layer as you see over here. So let me deselect this and I'll show you the cloning adjustments I made. So all I did was went ahead and cloned out all the scattered foam that was on the beach, made it look like the wave is advancing and the foam has not had a chance to scatter. Okay. Now the third adjustment I made was to actually go ahead and restore the sky. Now essentially what I did was I went into the raw image, processed the image for the sky, brought it out into Photoshop, and using a manual blending technique, IHDR blending, I ended up creating a mask and blending the sky in. So as you can see that as soon as I restore the sky, the colors come back. However, again, the same thing happens with the contrast. The clouds, instead of perfectly white, wispy clouds, they're slightly grayish. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go ahead and increase the contrast first. So I used a layer again to increase the contrast. Now the contrast is restored, but the clouds are still a bit grayish. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually increase the luminosity of the clouds. But the way I'm going to do it is not only I'm going to increase the luminosity of the clouds, but I'm also going to increase the luminosity of the mountain over here. So it will give it, the contrast will be adjusted in clouds as well as in mountains in one adjustment. So there you go. All I did was I changed the luminosity using the curves there, so the clouds got brighter. Here, let's see that again. So the takeaway from this exercise is that even though the conditions on the field are perfectly suitable to capture the image in a single shot, that image that you capture may not quite resemble what you remember because of the fixed dynamic range of the camera sensors. Now, in order to bring out the vibrant colors and the details in the image, you may have to go and process that image by making targeted adjustments. And those targeted adjustments can make a dramatic difference in your image. So we started out with an image that looks like this, and after making a few targeted adjustments, we ended up with an image that looks like that. We hope you enjoyed this brief tutorial.